A month after my daughter's wedding, the photographer called me. "Ma'am, I found a strange photo with your husband and your daughter. Come alone immediately." What he showed me turned everything upside down. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I used to think I was the luckiest grandmother in all of Charlotte, North Carolina. That was before the photograph changed everything. My name is Margaret Caldwell, Peggy to anyone who's ever sat at my kitchen table. And for 64 years, I had built a life out of simple, honest things. A white house on Birchwood Lane with a porch swing I repainted every spring. A garden that grew more tomatoes than one woman could ever reasonably eat. 2 daughters, a son, and 6 grandchildren who called me on Sundays without being reminded. My husband, Gerald, had passed 4 years prior, and the grief had settled into something manageable. A permanent guest I'd learned to live alongside. I wasn't lonely. I was, as my friend Dorothy liked to say, seasoned. My eldest daughter, Claire, was the quiet one. 38 years old, a 3rd-grade teacher. A woman who still ironed her pillowcases and kept a handwritten grocery list on the refrigerator door. She had dated carefully, cautiously, the way she did everything. And when she brought Derek Weston home for Thanksgiving 3 years ago, I watched him, the way I watched everything, with patience and without judgment. Derek was polished. That was the word that came to me first and never quite left. 41 years old, regional sales director for a pharmaceutical company, the kind of man who remembered to compliment the hostess and refilled your water glass before you noticed it was empty. He was handsome in a deliberate way. Hair always neat. Shoes always shined. Claire lit up around him, and I told myself that was enough. Was it enough? I asked myself that question many times afterward. The wedding was held on the 14th of September, on a Saturday that the weather treated like a gift. We rented Thornfield Estate, 20 miles outside Charlotte, a venue with white oak trees and a pond that reflected the afternoon light like hammered silver. Claire wore her grandmother's pearl earrings, my mother's pearls, and she cried when I fastened them for her in the bridal suite. I cried too. It was the kind of day that feels complete even while it's happening. I danced twice, ate too much wedding cake, and drove home just after 10 o'clock. I told myself everything was perfect, and for 31 days, I believed it. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon in October. I was pulling weeds from the flower bed along the front walk when my phone buzzed in my cardigan pocket. An unfamiliar number, local area code. "Mrs. Caldwell?" The voice was young, slightly uncertain. "This is Ryan Howell. I was the photographer at your daughter Claire's wedding." "Of course, Ryan." I straightened up, pressing one hand to my lower back. "How are you? Are the photos ready?" There was a pause that lasted just a breath too long. "That's actually why I'm calling. I've been going through the full gallery, all 1,800 shots. And I came across something. Something I can't just send in a digital file without talking to you first." The skin on my arms prickled despite the warm October sun. "What kind of something?" "I'd really rather show you in person, ma'am." His voice dropped slightly, the way voices do when someone is choosing words very carefully. "Would you be able to come to my studio?" "Alone, if possible." "I think it's important that you see this before anyone else does." I almost dismissed it. I almost said, "Ryan, just email me whatever you have." I was 64 years old and I had learned that most alarming things turned out to be nothing. A smudged name, a blurry background, someone caught mid-blink, but I didn't dismiss it. Something in his voice, that careful, almost reluctant seriousness, sat in my chest like a stone for the rest of the afternoon. I went the following morning. Ryan's studio was on Meridian Street, above a dry cleaning shop, the kind of small business held together by craft and determination. He met me at the door, shook my hand with both of his, and I noticed he didn't smile the way young people usually do when they're trying to put you at ease. He sat me down in front of a large monitor. He didn't speak. He simply opened a photograph. It took me a moment to understand what I was seeing. The image was time-stamped 6:47 p.m. During the cocktail hour, while guests mingled on the east lawn and the string quartet played Debussy. The location was the small side corridor just inside the venue's back entrance, partially obscured by a stone arch. Derek was in the photograph, my new son-in-law, on his wedding day. And so was a woman I had never seen before in my life. His hand was on her face. Her forehead was pressed to his, and the way they stood together, the way bodies speak their own language regardless of what the mouth claims, told me something that no caption, no context, no reasonable explanation could undo. I stared at that photograph for a long time without saying a word. Ryan quietly placed a box of tissues on the table beside me. I drove home from Ryan's studio on Meridian Street in a silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat over the engine. The October sky had turned the color of old pewter, low and pressing, and the traffic lights seemed to take longer than usual, as though the world itself had slowed to give me time to absorb what I'd seen. I didn't cry. Not then. Crying requires a kind of surrender I wasn't ready for. What I did instead was think. I sat in my car in my own driveway for 20 minutes, engine off, hands folded in my lap, and I thought with the cold, methodical focus of a woman who had once managed a household of 5 children on a schoolteacher's salary. Gerald used to say I was the only person he knew who could grieve and strategize at the same time. He meant it as a compliment. I had always accepted it as one. The facts, as I understood them. Ryan had photographed a moment between Derek and an unknown woman, intimate, unmistakable, at 6:47 p.m. on the evening of his own wedding. He had acted with discretion and genuine concern by coming to me rather than sending the image through the gallery portal where Claire might have found it herself. Ryan had also, he'd told me quietly before I left, noticed the woman earlier that evening near the parking area. She had not been on the guest list. She had arrived alone, spoken to no one else, and left before the reception dinner. A woman who came to a wedding she wasn't invited to, sought out the groom during the cocktail hour, and was gone before the cake was cut. I knew what that meant. I had been alive long enough to know exactly what that meant. The question that sat heaviest on me in that driveway was not what had happened. The question was how long. Because the photograph captured a moment of complete comfort. The ease between them. The lack of any furtive glance toward the door. That was not the body language of a man committing a reckless impulse. That was the posture of habit. And then, almost against my will, I began to count backwards. Claire had mentioned, 3 months before the wedding, that Derek had been stressed with work and was sometimes unreachable in the evenings. She'd laughed it off. You know how he gets when a quarter is closing. I had accepted that explanation because Derek had always seemed devoted. I had wanted him to be devoted. There had been one Sunday dinner, perhaps 6 weeks before the ceremony, when Derek's phone had buzzed repeatedly during the meal. He'd turned it face down on the table, which I'd noted as polite at the time. Now I cataloged it differently, and Claire, my careful, methodical Claire, had seemed thinner in the final month before the wedding. I'd attributed it to bridal nerves. Women lose weight before weddings. It's practically a cliché. But what if it wasn't nerves? What if some part of her already sensed something she hadn't yet allowed herself to name? That thought was the one that finally broke through. Not anger at Derek, not outrage at the betrayal, though both of those would come, but the image of my daughter, quiet and trusting, ironing her pillowcases in a house she shared with a man who had brought another woman to their wedding. I went inside. I made tea I didn't drink, and I began to think about what to do. The first instinct, the maternal primal instinct, was to call Claire immediately. But I stopped myself. If I called Claire now with nothing more than a single photograph and a stranger's description, one of two things would happen. Either she wouldn't believe me, or she would confront Derek before I had anything solid enough to protect her with. Derek was smooth. He was practiced. He would have an explanation ready, and in the absence of evidence, explanations were remarkably effective at making truth sound like paranoia. No, I needed more than one photograph. I called Dorothy, my oldest friend, a retired paralegal with 40 years of steady judgment, and asked her to come over that evening. I didn't tell her why. I just said I needed her. Then I called Ryan Howell. I asked him to send me the photo in full resolution, to preserve the original metadata, and to keep the image out of the wedding gallery entirely until I gave him further word. He agreed without hesitation. I thanked him, and before I hung up, I asked one more question. "Ryan, did you capture the woman's face clearly?" "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Clearly enough." "Good. That was the beginning of a plan." Dorothy arrived at 7 with a bottle of Riesling she didn't open and a legal pad she did. She was 71, stout, sharp as a carpet tack, and the only person I knew who could listen to a difficult story without interrupting, without softening her expression into pity, and without offering an opinion before she'd heard every single word. I told her everything: Ryan's call, the drive to Meridian Street, the photograph on the monitor, the time-stamped certainty of it. When I finished, Dorothy uncapped her pen. "All right," she said. "What do you want to accomplish?" That was exactly the right question. Not how do you feel, not that poor Claire, though I knew Dorothy felt both of those things. But what do you want to accomplish? I had loved her for 43 years for precisely this reason. "I want to know who she is," I said. "I want to know how long this has been going on, and I want Claire to have everything she needs before she makes any decision, legal, financial, or otherwise." Dorothy wrote 3 things on the legal pad. Then she looked up. "You'll want a private investigator. Someone licensed, someone discreet, someone who can pull records and surveillance legally so nothing gets thrown out if it ever goes to court." I was thinking the same thing. "I know a woman, Patricia Ames. She handled a case for a colleague of mine 8 years ago. She's thorough, and she doesn't gossip." I wrote the name down. Then Dorothy poured us both a glass of the Riesling after all. Patricia Ames operated out of a tidy office on the 2nd floor of a building on Providence Road. Her name on the door in plain gold lettering. She was 55, compact, with close-cropped gray hair, and the contained manner of a person who had learned long ago not to waste movement or words. I showed her the photograph on my phone. Ryan had sent me the full resolution file that morning, and watched her face as she studied it. "The woman on the left," I said. "That's who I need to identify." Patricia studied the image with professional detachment. "Clear enough. Give me 72 hours. I paid the retainer in cash, which Patricia accepted without comment. Those 72 hours were among the longest I can remember. I watered the garden. I baked a peach cobbler no one ate. I called my son in Denver and talked about nothing in particular, listening to his voice the way you listen to the radio when you need the house to feel less empty. On the 3rd morning, Patricia called. The woman's name was Brooke Landry, 34 years old. She lived in a rented apartment in South End. She worked as a marketing coordinator for the same pharmaceutical company where Derek was regional sales director. Patricia had obtained, through entirely legal means, she specified carefully, Derek's company calendar for the past 14 months, cross-referenced with his expense reports, and found 47 instances in which he and Brooke Landry had attended the same off-site meetings, conferences, and client dinners. 47. Patricia had also, on the second day of surveillance, photographed Derek's car parked outside Brooke Landry's apartment building at 11:20 p.m. on a Tuesday, 4 days after his wedding. 4 days. I sat down when she told me that. I hadn't realized I was standing. "I'll send you the full written report and the photographs," Patricia said. "Everything is dated, time-stamped, and documented to evidentiary standard." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time. I had suspected. Now I knew. There is a difference between those two states that anyone who has ever stood in either of them will understand. A difference as significant and as irreversible as stepping off a curb. You can suspect and still hope you're wrong. You cannot unknow. What I didn't know yet, what I would learn only later, was that Derek had noticed something had shifted. I found out afterward that the morning after I visited Patricia's office, Derek had called Dorothy. He'd made it casual, friendly, just checking in, asking if I seemed all right. "Peggy's been a little quiet lately, have you noticed?" Dorothy had told him I was fine and getting used to the empty nest. She had said it pleasantly, without a flicker. She'd called me immediately after and said simply, "He's watching you." That changed the timeline. If Derek was already alert, I had less room than I'd assumed. I needed to move from information gathering into action, carefully, legally, and before he had a chance to prepare. I called my daughter's family attorney the next morning and made an appointment. Not for Claire, not yet. For myself. To understand exactly what rights, what options, and what protections my daughter had before I put a single word in her ear. The point of no return had been crossed. The family attorney was a woman named Susan Hartley, mid-50s, silver-framed glasses, an office lined with law books that looked genuinely read rather than decorative. I had retained her years ago when Gerald passed to handle the estate, and I trusted her the way you trust a person who has seen you at your most vulnerable and remained steady. I spread Patricia's report across Susan's desk. The photographs, the calendar cross-references, the documented 14 months. Susan read without speaking. When she finished, she removed her glasses. "Has your daughter been told?" "Not yet. I wanted to understand the legal landscape first." She nodded. "That was wise." She folded her hands. "North Carolina is an equitable distribution state. Marital fault, including documented adultery, can be considered when a judge divides marital property, though it isn't the sole determining factor. More relevantly, North Carolina still has alienation of affection as a civil tort. If Claire chooses to pursue that route against the other party, against Brooke Landry, yes, she may have grounds." Susan paused. "But the immediate priority, if your daughter decides to separate, is ensuring she has independent legal representation before Derek has any opportunity to restructure assets." I thanked Susan, paid her consultation fee, and drove to Claire's house. I chose a Wednesday afternoon when I knew Derek would be at a client lunch. I had simply checked his public LinkedIn calendar, which he updated with professional regularity. Claire answered the door in her school clothes, a stack of ungraded papers tucked under one arm, and the look on my face must have told her something immediately, because she set the papers down on the hall table without a word and said, "Mom, come in." I told her everything. I laid Patricia's report on her kitchen table. The same table where I had helped her assemble Christmas cookies every December since she was 7 years old. I placed Ryan's photograph beside the report. I let her look. I let her take her time. Claire was quiet for a very long while. She did not cry immediately. That surprised me. She pressed both palms flat on the table and stared at the photograph with an expression I could not fully read, something between recognition and grief. "I knew something was wrong," she said finally. "I couldn't name it. I just knew." "I know you did." She looked up at me. "How long?" "At least 14 months that Patricia could document." Her hands tightened on the table edge. "Before we got engaged." "Yes." That was the moment she wept. 2 days later, Derek came to my house. He did not come alone. He came with his mother, Sylvia Weston, 68 years old, from Savannah, a woman constructed entirely of controlled surface and sharp interior angles. Sylvia had always been cordial to me at the precise temperature of cordial, required by social necessity, and not 1 degree warmer. I had never trusted her instinctively, and I had spent 2 years questioning that instinct, telling myself it was uncharitable. I opened the front door and looked at them both standing on my porch. "Peggy," Derek said, with the tone of a man who has decided to be reasonable, "we need to talk." "I think we do," I said, and stepped back to let them in. What followed was, I can only describe as, a performance. Derek positioned himself as a man who had made a mistake, a singular lapse, who was devastated by his own weakness and desperate to repair his marriage. Sylvia said little but sat very straight, watching me the way a second in a duel watches the opposing seconds. Measuring, calculating. Then the register shifted. Derek leaned forward. His voice dropped. "Peggy, I need you to understand something. The things you've put in motion, the attorney, the investigator, this is going to damage far more than just my marriage. My company doesn't need this kind of exposure. There are people involved at the regional level who could be significantly impacted." He paused. "I would hate for any of this to reflect on Claire, on her career, her reputation in this community." There it was, not a plea, a warning dressed as a plea, Sylvia added softly. "We're simply asking you to let the two of them work through this privately, as a family." I looked at Derek. I looked at Sylvia. I thought of Claire sitting at her kitchen table with her palms pressed flat and her voice saying, "Before we got engaged." "Thank you for coming," I said. "I'll show you out." Derek's jaw tightened. Sylvia's composure cracked just at the edges. They left. I locked the door behind them, sat down in Gerald's old armchair, and breathed. Then I called Dorothy and told her I needed 3 days. 3 days to rest, to be still, to let my hands stop shaking. She brought soup on Friday. She didn't stay long. She understood. On Monday morning, I was ready again. The gift basket arrived on Saturday morning, the second day of my 3 days of rest. It was elaborate. A handled wicker basket wrapped in cellophane, filled with a bottle of Chardonnay, a wheel of aged cheddar, Marcona almonds, fig preserves, and a small handwritten card on cream-colored stationery. The handwriting was Sylvia's. I recognized it from the place cards she'd written for the wedding rehearsal dinner. "Peggy, thinking of you during this difficult time. Family is everything. Sylvia." I set the basket on the counter and looked at it for a moment. Then I put the wine in the recycling, set the food aside for Dorothy's next visit, and dropped the card in the trash. I understood the gesture precisely. It was not kindness. It was an investment. A small, deniable bid for goodwill, something Sylvia could point to later as evidence of her own generosity and my intractability. We tried. We reached out. She refused. It was the language of people who perform reconciliation without intending it. The following Tuesday, Derek called. I let it go to voicemail. His message was warm, measured, and entirely unlike the man who had sat in my living room 4 days earlier and suggested my actions might damage Claire's reputation. He said he'd been doing a great deal of reflection. He said he wanted to make things right, not just with Claire, but with me. That he valued my place in the family, that he had enormous respect for me, and that he hoped we could speak soon, just the two of us, without attorneys or investigators involved. Without attorneys or investigators involved, I replayed that line twice. I did not call back. What I did instead was call my youngest daughter, Renata, in Atlanta. Renata was 59, sharper-tongued than Claire, and considerably less patient with pretense. She flew in the following Thursday. Didn't ask if she should come, just told me she'd booked a flight and would need picking up at Douglas at noon. She arrived with a carry-on bag and the expression of a woman who had already formed her opinions on the drive from the airport. I told her the full story over lunch at my kitchen table, and she listened in the same focused silence as Dorothy, though her silences had a different quality. Where Dorothy's patience was professional, Renata's was the concentrated stillness of someone working hard not to say what she was thinking until the moment was right. When I finished, she said, "What does Claire want? To end the marriage? She's already spoken to Susan Hartley." Good. Renata picked up her fork. Then we support her completely. What do you need from me? That question, what do you need from me, sat in my chest like something warm. I told her. I needed a witness. Not a legal witness, but a human one. Someone who knew the full picture, who could be present at difficult moments, who could sit beside me and Claire at the attorney's office and make it clear that we were not isolated and that we were not afraid. Renata nodded. Done. She stayed for 10 days. She slept in the guest room, helped me deadhead the dahlias in the garden, and drove with me to Susan Hartley's office on the following Monday, when Claire signed the initial separation papers. She held Claire's hand in the parking lot afterward, while I stood nearby, slightly apart, watching my eldest daughter's face, the particular expression of a person who has done something terrifying and irreversible and is discovering, with cautious surprise, that they are still standing. On the morning Renata arrived, Patricia Ames had sent a brief follow-up message. Derek had been seen, she noted, meeting with Sylvia at a restaurant in Dilworth on the previous Sunday. They had been there for 2 hours. Patricia hadn't surveilled the meeting, but had noted the fact as a data point. The two of them were coordinating. I filed that information away without surprise. Sylvia was the real strategist. I had known that from the beginning, sensed it in the precision of her hospitality, the way she always seemed to be composing herself rather than simply being herself. Derek was capable and smooth, but he operated reactively, adjusting his performance to what the room required. Sylvia planned ahead. The question was what she was planning. I didn't know yet, but I knew I had something she didn't. I wasn't performing anything. I wasn't managing an image. I was simply, methodically, doing what was right for my daughter. And that clarity had a stability that no amount of coordination or strategy could easily destabilize. Renata put it better than I could have. On the last night of her visit, sitting on the porch swing in the October dark with our tea, she said, "The advantage of telling the truth is you never have to remember what you said." I held on to that. They came on a Sunday. I saw the car from the kitchen window. Derek's silver Audi pulling up to the curb with the careful, unhurried pace of a vehicle whose driver wants to appear unthreatening. Sylvia was in the passenger seat. They sat for a moment before getting out, which told me they had talked through their approach on the drive over. I dried my hands on the kitchen towel. I took a breath. Then I went to open the front door before they could knock, which I did deliberately. I wanted them to know they had not surprised me. Peggy, Derek smiled. He was carrying a paper bakery bag, which I recognized immediately as a prop. We happen to be in the neighborhood. Do you have a few minutes? Happened to be. On my residential street on a Sunday morning. Come in, I said. I did not offer tea. I sat in the armchair. They took the sofa. Sylvia was wearing a pale blue cardigan, her silver hair set immaculately, and she had the appearance of a woman paying a pleasant social call. Only her eyes gave her away, watchful, assessing, moving between my face and the room with the quick efficiency of someone cataloging exits. Derek opened. He was sorry. He was humbled. He had been speaking with his pastor. Did I know they had a pastor they both respected, someone Claire had met and liked? He felt that with time, with real work, with the right guidance, he and Claire could find their way through this. He believed in the marriage. He believed in family. He looked at me with the open expression of a man who wanted very much to be believed. I let him speak. I gave nothing back. No nod, no softening expression, nothing that could be interpreted as warmth or receptivity. I simply waited. Then Sylvia spoke. Her approach was different, quieter, more intimate, as though the two of us were having a private conversation rather than a negotiation. She told me she understood I was acting out of love for Claire. She said she respected that. She said she was a mother, too, and that she knew what it was to be frightened for a child. She even touched her own collarbone lightly as she said it. A small, rehearsed gesture meant to signal vulnerability, to create the illusion of two women understanding each other across a table. Then she leaned forward slightly. "But Peggy," she said gently, "you have to understand what pursuing this publicly will mean for Claire. A legal separation, an investigation, a potential civil lawsuit. That's not a private matter. That becomes public record. People in this community talk. The school where Claire teaches. Those parents talk. Is that truly what you want for her? To be the subject of gossip? To be defined by this for years?" She held my gaze, waiting. It was, I acknowledged to myself, a skilled argument. It carried just enough genuine truth. Community gossip was real. Professional reputation did matter. To make the manipulation harder to name cleanly. That was the craft of it. Not a lie, exactly, but a truth deployed as a weapon, aimed at the one thing she had correctly identified as my deepest concern: Claire's well-being. "I hear what you're saying, Sylvia," I said. She relaxed a fraction. "But I want to make sure I understand you correctly," I continued. "You're suggesting that Claire should allow this to continue in private, without documentation or legal protection, in order to avoid gossip." I paused. "What you're describing is asking my daughter to protect your son's reputation at the expense of her own security. I don't think you mean to phrase it that way. But that is what you're describing." The fraction of relaxation vanished. Derek's voice gained an edge he'd kept controlled until that moment. "We're trying to keep this from becoming something that hurts everyone." "Derek," I said, "it already hurt everyone. It hurt everyone 14 months before the wedding. You made that choice. What happens now is a consequence of it, not a choice I'm making." Sylvia set down her cup. She had produced it from her own bag. I had not offered one, and I noted this detail carefully, and rose from the sofa with a deliberateness that communicated controlled anger far more effectively than any raised voice could have. Her pleasantness was gone entirely. What remained was exact and cold, the underlying structure of her that the cordial surface had always been covering. "I hope," she said quietly, "that you understand this will not end the way you're imagining." "I imagine it'll end with my daughter protected and informed," I said. "That's all I'm imagining." Derek stood without looking at me. He placed the bakery bag on the side table, as though the gesture of leaving it behind constituted some final, mild assertion, and moved toward the door. Sylvia paused at the threshold for just a moment, long enough to let me understand that she considered this a postponement, not a conclusion. I closed the door. I stood in my hallway in the quiet. My hands were not steady. I pressed one palm flat against the wall and breathed through the tremor, recognizing it for what it was. Not collapse, not weakness, but the body's honest and entirely reasonable response to threat. The meeting had gone the way I'd hoped, and it had still been frightening. Both of those things were true simultaneously, but underneath the tremor, underneath the cold that had settled at the base of my sternum, there was something else. A clarity so sharp it almost had a sound. The more they pushed, the more clearly I could see exactly what I was protecting and exactly why it mattered. I thought of Claire in the parking lot outside Susan Hartley's office, discovering she was still standing. I went to my desk, opened my calendar, and confirmed Monday's appointment. My hand had steadied by the time I set the pen down. Susan Hartley had filed the initial separation paperwork in early November. By the third week of the month, Derek had retained his own attorney, a man named Fowler, known apparently for aggressive discovery tactics, and had submitted a counter-declaration, challenging the grounds, claiming the marriage had been stable and that Claire's decision had been influenced by outside parties. Outside parties. I presumed I was among them. What Derek did not know, what neither he nor Sylvia could have anticipated, was that Patricia Ames had not stopped working when I'd received the first report. At my instruction, she had continued documenting. And in those additional weeks, she had obtained something that changed the weight of everything. Patricia had been tracking Brooke Landry's public social media, entirely legal, entirely open, and had found, on a now deleted but screen-captured Instagram post from the previous March, a photograph. Brooke Landry and Derek Weston, photographed together in what was clearly a hotel restaurant in Raleigh, tagged by a mutual friend at a sales conference with a caption that referred to the two of them, lightly but unmistakably, as a couple. The post had been deleted within 24 hours, likely once someone recognized the risk. Patricia had captured it before deletion and preserved the metadata. March. 7 months before the wedding. 4 months before Derek proposed to Claire. Susan reviewed the additional evidence and filed a supplemental declaration. She also forwarded the documentation to the attorney handling the potential alienation of affection claim, a separate proceeding against Brooke Landry, which Claire had quietly decided to pursue. The mediation session was scheduled for the Tuesday before Thanksgiving at Susan's office on Queens Road. I was not present in the room for the legal proceedings. That was between Claire and her attorney. But I was in the waiting area with Renata, who had flown back from Atlanta for the week, and Dorothy, who had canceled a dental cleaning to be there. We sat in 3 chairs along one wall. We brought our own coffee. We did not speak very much. Some vigils are best kept in companionable silence. What I had not anticipated, what none of us had anticipated, was that Derek would bring Sylvia. She was not his attorney. She had no legal standing in that room. But she arrived with him at 9:15, dressed in the same collected, impeccable manner as always, and it was only when Susan's paralegal appeared in the waiting room doorway and said quietly, "Mrs. Caldwell, we need a moment," that I understood something had shifted. I went into the conference room. Derek and his attorney Fowler were seated on one side of the table. Claire was on the other with Susan, and Sylvia, who had been asked to wait outside and had apparently declined, stood near the window with the bearing of a woman who intended to anchor the room by the force of her presence alone. I took a position near the door. I did not sit. I wanted to be able to see everyone's face. Susan spoke first. She presented the supplemental evidence methodically, the way a person presents something they have no doubt about. Patricia's full report. The deleted Instagram capture with metadata intact. The 72 documented contact instances across 14 months. The expense report, cross-references. The surveillance photographs, including Derek's car outside Brooke Landry's apartment building at 11:20 p.m., 4 days after the wedding. Fowler began his objection before Susan had finished her third sentence. It was a reflex, the professional equivalent of throwing up a hand, not a real argument yet, just a signal that an argument was coming. Derek said nothing. He had gone, in the space of perhaps 40 seconds, from the composed and reasonable man who had sat on my sofa with a bakery bag to a man staring at the surface of the table as though he were trying to read something in the grain of the wood. Sylvia was the one who broke. She did not shout. It was quieter than that, and considerably worse. She addressed the room as though she had been given the floor at a board meeting, her voice controlled and precise and furious underneath both of those things. She said this was a coordinated attack. She said and here she turned and looked directly at me, standing by the door. Had been systematically building a case for weeks, hiring investigators, consulting attorneys, turning Derek's wife against him before the girl had been given room to think. Your son's wife, Susan said, without raising her voice at all, is 38 years old and holds a professional teaching license. She is not a girl, and she is not confused. She has been manipulated by her mother. Sylvia, Derek's voice, low, clipped, who has never once accepted this marriage, who made up her mind from the beginning. Sylvia! Sharper, with a warning in it that I recognized. The sound of a man who knows the performance has gone off script and is trying to pull it back. She stopped. The silence in that room had a particular texture. The specific quiet of a space where something irrevocable has just been said. Fowler spoke quietly to Derek. Derek nodded, once, tightly. He looked up then, and his gaze moved from Claire's face to mine with the slow, deliberate quality of a man making himself do something. What I saw in his expression was not what I'd expected. Not defiance. Not the smoothness he had maintained for 3 years. Something much simpler and much sadder. The exhaustion of a person who has been carrying a constructed version of themselves for too long and can no longer remember what was underneath it. Whatever sympathy that observation might have produced in me, I set aside. We'll review the supplemental materials, Fowler said, gathering his papers with the practiced calm of a man professionally accustomed to recalibrating in real time. We'll be in touch by end of week. They filed out. Sylvia last. She did not look at me as she passed. That, I noted, was new. The room settled. Claire exhaled. A long, slow release, as though she had been holding that breath since September. She looked at Susan. Then she looked at me. Is it over? She asked quietly. The hard part, Susan said, with the careful precision of a good attorney, is mostly over. I crossed the room and sat down across from my daughter. I folded my hands on the table. For the first time in weeks, perhaps in months, I felt something loosen in my chest. Not triumph. Something quieter than that. The feeling of a door closing on a room you never wanted to be in. The weeks that followed the mediation session moved with the particular quality of time after a storm. Not yet calm, but visibly clearing. The light was different. The air had changed. Fowler, to his credit as a professional, did not pursue the contested grounds after reviewing Patricia's supplemental report in full. The documentation was too thorough, too legally sound, and too precisely time-stamped to build any credible counter-narrative around. Derek, on his attorney's advice, withdrew the claim that outside parties had influenced Claire's decision. He withdrew it formally, in writing, as part of the procedural record. That withdrawal was not a minor thing. It was a documented retreat, filed with the court, which meant it existed permanently and could not later be reframed as anything else. The separation agreement was finalized in the first week of December. Claire retained the marital home, a townhouse in Dilworth that Derek had purchased in both names before the engagement. Under North Carolina's equitable distribution principles, Susan had argued successfully that the documented marital fault weighed significantly in Claire's favor, alongside the fact that Claire had contributed consistently to household expenses throughout the relationship, while Derek's income had supported significant personal expenditures that his own financial records, subpoenaed during discovery, did not entirely account for. Derek removed his belongings over a single weekend in early December. I spent that Saturday at Claire's kitchen table, available, but not hovering. I brought a pot of chicken soup. I did not comment on the sound of boxes being moved, on the trips Derek made to the parking area with his things. On the way, the townhouse felt lighter with each carload that left. When the moving truck pulled away in the late afternoon, Claire stood at the front window for a moment without speaking. Then she turned and said, "Do you want more soup?" And I said yes, and we sat together until it was dark. The civil claim for alienation of affection was filed against Brooke Landry in December. North Carolina is one of the few remaining states where this cause of action exists in law, and Claire's attorney had assessed the documented evidence, Patricia's report, the deleted Instagram post, the 14 months of cross-referenced contact, as substantively strong. Brooke Landry retained her own attorney within a week of being served. The proceedings would be lengthy, as civil litigation always is, and I did not allow myself to place too much of my attention there. That was Claire's matter, conducted through her own attorney, and my role in it had already been played. There was one more consequence I had not engineered, but which arrived nonetheless. Approximately 3 weeks after the mediation, Patricia received information through a professional contact, entirely above board, entirely sourced from non-confidential channels, that Derek's pharmaceutical company had initiated an internal human resources review of his professional conduct. The relationship with Brooke Landry had violated the company's fraternization policy, a policy that existed in the employee handbook, had been distributed to all regional-level staff, and had been acknowledged in writing by every person at Derek's seniority level. The review was, by all accounts, not punitive in design. But Derek resigned before it concluded. He relocated to a position with a smaller firm in Greensboro. The title was lower. The territory was smaller. The pharmaceutical industry, it turned out, is not a large world, and professional reputations, the real ones, not the performed ones, have a way of traveling through it efficiently. I did not feel satisfaction at that news in the way I might once have expected to. What I felt was something more precise and less heated. The recognition that consequences, when they are honest and proportionate, tend to find their own level without requiring anyone to push them there. I had not sought to damage Derek's career. I had sought to protect my daughter. The consequences were his own, grown from his own choices, and they had arrived on their own schedule. Sylvia called me once more, in the second week of December. I answered on the third ring. She was not the woman who had stood near the conference room window 3 weeks earlier. The sharpness was absent, replaced by something flatter and more tired. The voice of a person who has spent considerable energy and arrived somewhere they did not intend. She said she hoped I understood she had only ever been trying to protect her son. I told her I understood that entirely. I told her I had only ever been trying to protect my daughter. There was a pause between us. A long one, not uncomfortable exactly, but full, in which I believe we both recognized something true. That we were two mothers who had loved our children with complete sincerity and had made entirely different choices about what that love required of us. We would live with those choices differently. Neither of us said that aloud. We did not need to. She did not call again. Christmas came to Birchwood Lane the same as it always had. The same artificial tree Gerald had chosen in 1987. The same accumulated decades of ornaments. Claire's second-grade ceramic drum. Renata's kindergarten paper star. The glass ball etched with Gerald's name that I unwrapped last. Held for a moment. And hung in its place near the center of the tree, where it had always gone. Claire sat in the armchair closest to the fire. She looked thinner than I would have liked, and I noted it privately, and said nothing. But she held herself differently than she had in September, or October, or November. Not the careful composure of a woman managing concealed uncertainty, but the quieter uprightness of someone who had come through something and was beginning, cautiously, to discover what was on the other side of it. She laughed at dinner, a real one, sudden, at something James said, the kind of laugh that catches a person before they have a chance to modulate it. It was the best sound I heard all year. James had flown in from Denver with his wife and their 3 children, who ran through the downstairs in their socks and knocked over exactly 1 ornament, which was precisely the right number. Dorothy came for dessert and stayed until nearly 11, which was uncharacteristic and therefore wonderful. Renata had driven up from Atlanta and was already asleep in the guest room before the last of the dishes were done. Before everyone arrived in the early morning quiet, I stood in the kitchen with my coffee and looked out at the dormant garden, bare-stemmed, waiting. I thought of Gerald. I thought of what he would have said about all of it. He would have said, "You did what needed doing." He was economical with praise. It was one of the things I had loved most about him. I heard from upstairs the first sounds of grandchildren waking, thumping small feet, a muffled argument about something inconsequential. Then laughter. I turned toward the stairs. Spring came to Birchwood Lane the way it always did. Slowly, then suddenly, the dogwood in the front yard white blooming before I had remembered to expect it. The months that followed Christmas moved with a different quality than the months before. Not easier, exactly. Healing doesn't move along a smooth gradient, but more spacious. There was room to breathe again, room to notice ordinary things. The particular angle of February, light through the kitchen window, the smell of the soil when I turned the first beds in March, the way a Tuesday could pass without a single moment of dread. Claire returned to work full-time in January. She had taken a reduced schedule in November and December. Her principal had been quietly understanding. And returning to her classroom had, by her own account, been one of the most stabilizing things she did. She called me every Sunday, as she always had, but the calls were lighter now. She talked about her students' reading progress, a book club she'd joined with 2 colleagues, a weekend trip she was planning with Renata in the spring. In April, she called to tell me she'd had coffee with someone, a landscape architect named Thomas, calm and unhurried, met through a mutual friend. She wasn't ready for anything serious. She just wanted me to know it had felt, for the first time in a long time, like something possible. I didn't say everything I was thinking. I said, "That sounds lovely." It was enough. Dorothy and I resumed our Friday lunches and found them even better than before. That particular quality of friendship that has been through something and come out the other side richer for it. We tried a new restaurant on Providence Road every few weeks, rated with entirely subjective scores that had no consistent criteria, and argued about them at length. I looked forward to those Fridays enormously. I took a watercolor class in February, something I had been postponing for 2 years. The instructor was patient and soft-spoken, and had no expectations of anyone, which freed everyone to be surprisingly capable. By April, I had completed a small painting of the Birchwood Lane dogwood that Dorothy declared was genuinely good. I hung it in the hallway. James called from Denver to say his wife was expecting their 4th child. I cried in the best possible way, standing in the kitchen, pressing my palm to the counter for balance. Life was not perfect. It was ordinary, and ordinary was more than enough. Derek Weston relocated to Greensboro after leaving the pharmaceutical company. The HR review had generated enough industry-level awareness to complicate his next position considerably. His new role was significantly lower in seniority. He and Brooke Landry had ended their relationship within 2 months of the wedding. The civil lawsuit, I imagined, had introduced a friction that whatever they'd had could not absorb. I did not wish him harm. What I wished was irrelevance, the quiet, ordinary irrelevance of someone who had passed through our lives and left, whose absence was no longer loaded with anger, but simply with the neutrality of fact. Sylvia moved from Savannah to be closer to Derek in Greensboro. I heard this without comment. It struck me only as a closing bracket on a chapter. Brooke Landry's legal representation eventually reached a settlement in the alienation of affection case. The terms were confidential. Claire told me only that it was satisfactory, and I did not press. What remained when everything had settled was the life on Birchwood Lane. The porch swing repainted every spring. The garden. The grandchildren who called on Sundays, and one more expected in the autumn. The Friday lunches. The watercolor class. The dogwood blooming white before I remembered to expect it. Gerald's armchair by the window facing the garden, catching the morning light, kept exactly where he had placed it, because some things you keep exactly as they are. Looking back now, I understand what that autumn taught me. Truth is patient, but it needs someone willing to carry it. I was 64 years old. I was afraid. I did it anyway. If you ever find yourself holding a photograph that changes everything, don't look away. Don't wait for someone else to act. Gather your people, document everything, and trust that doing what is right is its own kind of strength. What would you have done in my place? Leave a comment. I'd truly like to know. And if this story meant something to you, share it, subscribe, and come back. Thank you for listening.